far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to seek the pale enchanted gold. Hello, good morning. Perhaps hello again in some cases. Long time no see. I'm Mark Atherton, one of the team of tutors in English at this college. I was here before. I had a roundabout route back to this college. I studied here originally, modern languages with English, and then I moved into medieval studies and English for graduate work at York, University of York. I taught at various universities here and abroad, as you can see on the screen, and then I returned to Regent about 25 years ago. I teach Old and Middle English literature. Beowulf and Chaucer is basically sums it up, I would say. I also teach English language, so the linguistics of English, and I write on Old English, Anglo-Saxon. That's my research area. Old English language and literature, and the history of the study of language. I also write about Tolkien, and today I want to develop some ideas that I started in this book, There and Back Again, Tolkien and the Origins of the Hobbit. My theme is how and why J.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit. Now, The Hobbit, of course, is his first published work of fiction. It's not the same as The Lord of the Rings, but it's intended nowadays to be the prequel to The Lord of the Rings. Here is the man himself in his study at Merton College, I would think. He was at Pembroke for 20 years and then at Merton subsequently. Let's have a look at some of the dates. Have a look at that screen and just sort of think your way into his life a little bit. It must have been very typical for most of the people, most young men around this time. Go to school, go to university, go to the Great War, the First World War. Tolkien did all those things. He also married just before he joined the war, and family life became important to him. His first job was actually back in Oxford. He studied at Oxford, and he worked for the Oxford English Dictionary, which was very appropriate for him because he was a specialist in similar things to what I do, or should I say I do similar things to what he did. Old and Middle English, the languages of medieval Europe, Northern European mythology, Beowulf, these were his specialties. And working for the Oxford English Dictionary in the etymology department was his first job. That lasted a couple of years after the war. Then he went to Leeds to become a university lecturer. He returned to Oxford with the great accolade of becoming the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. The rest you probably know a little bit about. He was a member of the Inklings, wrote The Hobbit in and published it in 1937. He then immediately wrote the sequel, or should I say he immediately started to write the sequel, and it took him a good 10 years or more, and it finally was published in 1954 to 5. The Hobbit then is his first published writing, fictional writing, although he'd written other stories before, many stories in fact, which have never been published. Its full title is The Hobbit, or There, Back and Again, and it tells the story of a journey with a goal. At one point, for instance, it's a kind of story about being on the road, you could say, certainly for the first half, and the getting there. And here the travellers are standing before the entrance to Mirkwood, the dark, forbidding forest that lies across their route. This, of course, is a fantasy story, and fantasy stories are usually set in a different world to ours, but a world that is presented realistically. So it's not realistic or imitation of our reality, but nevertheless, it's not a surreal story. So here they are facing a forest, and the leader, the wizard Gandalf, informs them that he has other matters to attend to, and he's going to leave them to continue their journey unguided. You can see the response of the other travelers, the dwarves and the hobbit, at this point in the story. Goodbye, said Gandalf, wizard, to Thorin, the prince of the dwarves. And goodbye to you all, goodbye. Straight through the forest is your way now. Don't stray off the track. This is a classic fairy tale motif, isn't it, really? Don't leave the path. If you do, there's 1,000 to 1, you will never find it again. And never get out of Mirkwood. And then I don't suppose I or anyone else will ever see you again. Do we really have to go through? Groaned the Hobbit. This is a children's story, of course, and you can tell by the style. Hobbits are small, human-like creatures who live in very comfortable accommodation, but burrows, nevertheless, done out with nice furniture and so on. And you could say that the hobbits are what we call in literary studies, the focalizers of the story. We see the whole story through the eyes of this gentlemanly bachelor who lives a very comfortable life in his bachelor's pad in the hill at Hobbiton. And he's been employed by this wizard almost against his wishes to go on this journey. And what does the wizard say? Yes, you do. If you want to get to the other side, you must either go through or give up your quest. And I am not going to allow you to back out now, Mr. Baggins. Bilbo Baggins, of course, being the name of the Hobbit. So what we have here is, for a children's story, a way of catching the sympathies of the child reader or the child listener. It's definitely at the beginning of the story a case of a child listener. The story is told in the manner of an adult telling a story to children, certainly at first. And you can see that you must either go through the woods or give up your quest. This is a quest narrative. A classic kind of tale goes back to ancient epics and medieval romances. The travelers have to fulfill some kind of quest, find something. In this case, it is enchanted gold, and they have to somehow deal with the guardian of that treasure, the dragon. Typical of the author's style, of course, then, is to have this song in the early stages of the story. And the treasure is a massive treasure, but it also has a special Arkenstone, and the dwarf leader is terribly obsessed with finding this special jewel. The dwarf leader can be seen as the other hero of this story, and it's a story about pride that comes before a fall. The dwarf leaders fall from grace then is linked into a narrative about finding this treasure. It's his tragic desire for this fabled jewel that almost brings about the failure of the whole expedition. So in this talk, I'm going to argue that the Arkenstone, that's this special jewel here, represents a theme in Tolkien's fiction, namely the idea that certain things, certain objects function as willful objects. They are symbolic objects, which this kind of fiction, fantasy fiction, is entirely suited to deal with. The willful objects, in this case, the Arkenstone, can capture the light of the sun or the stars. Look at that verse from the song that the dwarves sing. On silver necklaces they strung the flowering stars. On crowns they hung the dragon fire. In twisted wire they enmeshed the light of moon and sun. This sounds like imagery to describe the wonder of this jewel, but in Tolkien's mythology, and we have to remember that Tolkien had developed a mythology long before he actually wrote this children's story. Light is something that you can work with. It's almost a liquid. You can infuse it into your craftsmanship. You can make silver necklaces which capture the light of the stars or the light of the moon and the sun. So if you know the Hobbit, and you may well do already, you'll see that there are other willful objects in Tolkien's fiction. At one level, the swords which some of the heroes carry glow in the dark when the enemy is approaching. Another example, a humorous example, and we have to remember that at one level, The Hobbit is a children's story and it's meant to be fun. It's an adventure story, sure, but it also has a lot of humor in it. And at one point, near the beginning of their story, in chapter 2, in fact, on their journey, they come across trolls. And trolls are not particularly friendly creatures. They're like small giants, really. Come from Scandinavian literature. And at one point, Bilbo Baggins, who's been employed by the wizard and the dwarves as their spy, their burglar, their private investigator, he is sent to have a look at these trolls who seem to be camping near the pathway that they're using. And Bilbo tries to steal one of their purses. And of course, it's one of these willful objects. As soon as he tries to steal the purse, it cries out, "Here, what are you doing?" in a Cockney kind of accent. And Bilbo is almost captured by these trolls. And this is the first adventure on their way. In many ways, then you can see The Hobbit as a set of adventures, a set almost of separate fairy stories woven together or stitched together by the plot of being on the road and having adventures along the way. You have to go through it if you're going to get through and fulfill your quest. While he was a soldier, or rather it started earlier, while he was a schoolboy, while he was a student studying medieval literature, while he was a soldier, a signals officer in the Lancashire Fusiliers, Tolkien had started writing poetry. In some ways, you might say that he was a budding poet, and it became, even for a while, he became a war poet. At the same time as writing poetry and drawing, and his poetry was drawing on it, he was writing the mythology. And this mythology eventually became the published Silmarillion. This was published in 1977 by his son, Christopher Tolkien, who dedicated most of his career to publishing Tolkien's unpublished writings, unpublished from his own lifetime. And the Silmarillion was one of the first of these. It's a kind of epitome of the mythology that Tolkien had been developing. There were no shortcuts with Tolkien, really. When he decided to do something, he did it very thoroughly. So in one of the stories in the Silmarillion, the great craftsman, the artisan Feanor, designs and makes these wondrous jewels, which are known as the Silmarils. And these jewels capture rather like the Arkenstone, and perhaps the Arkenstone is based on a Silmaril. It captures the light of nature within them. They have some kind of magical, psychological influence on characters. And at the end of the story of the Silmarillion, the three Silmarils are restored back to the rocks of the earth, the waters of the sea, and the light of the sky. In a way, they embody the elements out of which the earth is made. In The Lord of the Rings, of course, there are other willful objects, and the most important of these are the rings of power. Some of these rings are beneficial to their wearers and the lands or the regions in which they live. So we have 3 elven rings, which seem to create pockets or areas of otherworld, of the traditional otherworld of medieval literature, sometimes known as fairyland in more recent folk tales. But above all, it's the one ring made by the Satan figure, the Lucifer figure, Sauron. And the one ring is a treacherous device that grants its wearer almost limitless power, but at the same time has negative effects on them. Now, the ring in The Hobbit is supposed to be the same ring as the ring in the intended sequel, The Lord of the Rings. They call it the intended sequel. That's perhaps not quite right. It's The Lord of the Rings developed out of the success of the Hobbit. So Tolkien didn't know, in fact, I'd say. He didn't know he was going to write The Lord of the Rings until he actually wrote The Hobbit and published The Hobbit and found that it was being a successful seller. So what we have then is in The Hobbit is the ring with a small lowercase letter R. And in The Lord of the Rings, this has been developed into something much more ominous and willful and negative, the ring with a capital R. But instead of the ring, we have a more positive force somehow embodied and symbolized in this Arkenstone, which eventually is restored, and it is placed on the tomb of Thorin in the heart of the mountain at the end of the story. So the second edition of The Hobbit came out in 1951. If you remember from our dates, that's shortly before The Lord of the Rings was published. So The Hobbit, rather like The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien said about The Lord of the Rings that this tale grew in the telling. And you could almost say the same about The Hobbit, because he published The Hobbit. He was asked almost immediately to write a sequel. It took him a long time to do, and he changed his mind about how to write, about what fantasy was capable of doing. And this meant that some of the events in The Hobbit needed changing in order to fit in with the plot of The Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien was no longer writing for children, not since he had delivered his lecture on fairy stories for the University of St. Andrews in 1939. So this was 2 years after he'd published The Hobbit. By the way, if you find any of these first editions and you're not particularly interested, do let me know, because I don't mind owning some of these. I think this one is probably worth about £1,500. It's not just for the money, I just want them on my shelf, actually. Anyway, so the Andrew Lang lecture, a regular lecture, was delivered by Professor J.R.R. Tolkien in 1939, and it was later published in the volume Tree and Leaf, and he basically argues that folk tales are vestiges of older legends that were probably presented in earlier literature as oral epics, romances, lays, and poems. They got into folk tales and were told by ordinary people, and finally descended, if you like, according to popular conceptions, descended into the nursery, and were told by your nurse, if you are rich enough to have a nurse, in the nursery as a fairy story. But originally, then these fairy stories have a pedigree and a heritage, and they preserve old, sometimes ancient plots. This is one of Tolkien's beliefs, which he gets from the Brothers Grimm, who were professors of philology in the 19th century, and of course, as well as being professors of ancient languages, also collected folk tales. Now, how different the ring is in The Hobbit, in the original Hobbit, 1937, and the draft versions of it from the second edition of 1951. Let's have a look at the moments when Bilbo found the ring in the early version, the original version. They've decided, because of the danger of goblins, a typical fairy tale enemy, if ever there was one, instead of crossing the mountains, they're going to go through them, and they're escaping through the tunnels when Bilbo bumps his head and he wakes up in the dark. He doesn't know where he is. The others have run on ahead, and he's groping around in the darkness. Certainly, he did find what felt like a ring of metal lying on the floor in the tunnel. He put it in his pocket, but that didn't help much. Typical of the style of The Hobbit, addressing the reader. That didn't help much. Let's get on with the story. This is not particularly significant at this point. A little bit later, he's going to need this ring to make himself invisible. But he doesn't know that at the time, and that's all it does, really. What about the second edition of 1951? This is the rewritten version of chapter 5. Lots of changes. Bilbo guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. So the later text rewords this idea so that his hand becomes the agent rather than he. His hand becomes the agent and the person doing the action, the subject, the grammatical subject of the verb, met. It's almost as though one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. And the object that he takes, a ring of metal in the original, has become a tiny, cold ring of metal, or rather a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. And the changes accumulate to suggest something. The coldness is already something slightly sinister, or it will become sinister as we read on. As Bilbo runs away from Gollum, Gollum is the nasty creature who he encounters in the tunnel at the lake. And Gollum is chasing Bilbo after the riddle competition, if you know the story. And Bilbo put his left hand in his pocket as he ran away, and the ring felt very cold. Not just cold, but very cold, as it quickly slipped onto his groping finger. The ring can act of its own desires. It needs to get away from this creature who lives at the bottom of dark tunnel, because it has evil work to do in the world. It has agency. So these changes are minor, but they correspond closely with many more substantial changes in the 1951 account of the finding and keeping of the ring. And there are various scholars who've covered all those changes. One of them, of course, is Rateliff, who's written the history of the Hobbit, a 2-volume annotated version of the edition of the early texts of the Hobbit. And as Rateliff shows, it's significant that Gollum, the creature who Bilbo was running away from just then, is also changed in this new chapter 5. In the first edition, it's not absolutely clear what kind of creature he is. He's not a degraded hobbit, and that's what he becomes in the later version. Gollum is some other kind of creature, more of a kind of monster. He flaps along noisily with his large webbed feet. And there is a suggestion that his eyes are mounted on stalks and shine in the dark like lamps. And to those readers who've read Tolkien's other children's stories, I'd speculate that the original Gollum resembles rather a more malevolent version of the small, grumpy, but friendly sand sorcerer in Tolkien's 1930s story, Roverandom, which in turn was clearly inspired by another ugly creature with eyes on stalks and bat-like ears and monkey's feet in Edith Nesbit's story, 5 Children and It. Here is another of those first editions, which I wouldn't mind having on my shelf if you're feeling generous. Here's another picture from a BBC version of that story. You can see he hasn't actually got eyes on stalks there, but that's what he does in the Edith Nesbit story. And here are the children finding this creature. Oh, there you can see the eyes on the stalks at the end of his antennae. So the early Gollum then is some kind of monster, and he's different. He's different. This is the classic Gollum type figure, this kind of emaciated, twisted character who's been somehow perverted by owning this malevolent ring for so many, probably centuries. A reminder, I've mentioned already, that Tolkien was still quite a young man when he joined the University at Leeds, and then in 1925 became the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon. He was teaching Old English literature, Beowulf, the epic Beowulf, about a fight against monsters. The young hero Beowulf has to fight a humanoid monster called Grendel. And I wonder if Grendel or some elements of Grendel have gone into the monster Gollum that Bilbo encounters. Later in the epic story of Beowulf, he becomes a king, 50 years go by, and a threat to his kingdom appears in the shape of a dragon. And this is the symbolism of the epic story, Beowulf, the poem. The poem is about other things. It's about kingship, leadership, about succession, about feuds. There's much more going on in the poem than just the monsters, as Tolkien showed. Although he did emphasize that monsters are important symbols in this kind of literature. So Tolkien met Edith while he was still living in Birmingham, and they eventually married. I'm missing out parts of the story here. They had 4 children, and as a young father, Tolkien enjoyed telling his own stories to his children. And he adapted his stories from the poems that he was reading and studying and teaching. So let's go back to the first version of The Hobbit. And this is the riddle competition that Bilbo has with this strange monsters he meets in the dark by the lake in the heart of the mountain. And this strange creature, Gollum, says, doesn't guess easy. It. And he loves to talk in the third person. It being Bilbo, of course. Gollum refers to him as it. It must have a competition with us, my precious. And my precious in this early version is not the ring. If you know the films or if you've read the Lord of the Rings, you'll know that Gollum is always talking about my precious ring. But he's talking about himself here. He's a kind of schizophrenic monster. They must have a competition with us, my precious. If Precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it. But if it asks us and we doesn't answer, we gives it a present. Okay, this is not a nice monster, but this is a nicer monster and a much more honorable monster than in the second edition of The Hobbit. He's basically suggesting a competition where Gollum, if he loses the competition, will give Bilbo a present. And what is the present? It's the ring. Absolutely unthinkable in The Lord of the Rings for someone who's owned the ring for so long to so willingly give it away. In some ways, as Tom Shippey has argued in his great work of criticism, The Road to Middle-earth, the ring is a symbol of addiction. It's almost like a drug. Once you have it, most people become addicted to it and cannot give it away. They are addicted to the power it bestows on them. It's worth emphasizing, I think, though, that The Hobbit in the second edition remains basically unaltered. As Raycliffe puts it, Tolkien, quote, decided to respect the Hobbit's autonomy. In other words, The Hobbit is a book that can stand on its own. So according to Raycliffe, then, Tolkien was keeping such changes to a minimum. So he changed chapter 5 to make it fit with The Lord of the Rings. And in the end, he basically said that the first edition, that the story of The Hobbit in the first edition was actually written by Bilbo. And Bilbo was, in fact, under the baleful influence of the ring, and therefore wrote The Hobbit in the third person about himself, changing what had actually happened, because he was disguising the fact that he had cheated in order to get the ring and didn't want to give it back to anybody else. But be that as it is, it's possible to read The Hobbit then as a separate story. And what's the ring really like in The Hobbit? Even in the second edition of 1951. That's the one we all read. It doesn't matter which illustrations you have in your version at home, unless you're particularly fortunate and own the first edition. You have the second edition at home of 1951 in some reprint. And if you look at chapter 5, where Bilbo actually gives away how it's possible for him to suddenly appear and rescue the dwarves from the giant spiders. The dwarves are very respectful now of Bilbo. They had been very uncertain about Gandalf's choice of this respectable fellow to be their burglar, their private spy and investigator on their expedition, on their quest. But now they find Bilbo quite impressive. And even having a ring is a cause for respect. For they saw, and this is the text of the second edition, for they saw that he had some wits, as well as luck and a magic ring. Wits, luck, and a magic ring. All three are very useful possessions. So none of the characters in the story react towards the ring with desire in the story of The Hobbit. And this is surely one of the major differences between The Hobbit, even in the second edition, and The Lord of the Rings. If you know anything of the story of The Lord of the Rings, you'll know that some members of the Fellowship of the Ring, of the Fellowship of Travelers who accompany Bilbo's nephew, Frodo, on another kind of quest, on a negative quest, if you like, a quest not to find something in this new adult novel, but to destroy something, to destroy the ring. One of the characters in the Fellowship, Boromir, the warrior knight from Gondor, has been infected by desire for the ring and tries to wrest the ring by force from Frodo when the opportunity arises. But in The Hobbit, as I say, the dwarves are simply fascinated by that whole vanishing business, as they call it. And they're interested in the story of how he acquired the ring, and they want to hear it again and again, just because they're simply impressed by the way Bilbo has changed. Now, this is the critic Tom Shippey in his book, The Road to Middle-earth, summing up what the ring is in The Hobbit. The ring is just a prop, a stage prop, like the marvelous devices common in fairy tales or legends. There's a wish-fulfilling ring in the Brother Grimm's The King of the Golden Mountain, and the Cloak of Invisibility. The ring is a prop for Bilbo's status with the dwarves. For Tom Shippey then, the ring, as presented in The Hobbit, acts rather like Samuel Colt's famous pistol in the American Wild West. The Colt 45 is the equalizer. It places all men on an equal footing. They're all the same stature. And Bilbo can now hold his head up and gain the respect of his traveling companions. He can employ the ring usefully and effectively to help them at various points in the ongoing quest. So it's not only the nature of the ring that changes in the world of The Hobbit compared to the world of The Lord of the Rings. Another example are the dwarves, as presented in chapters 1 and 2 of The Hobbit. They are named after a list in a mythical poem written in Old Norse, medieval Old Norse. And they also seem to have stepped straight out of one of Grimm's fairy tales. Same is true of the goblins in chapter 4. You find them in fairy tales. You find them in Victorian fairy tales, like George MacDonald. What else is different? The goblins. Again, Grimm's fairy tales, George MacDonald's goblins in his Princess and the Goblin stories. What about this whole sense of a fight between good and evil that you get in The Lord of the Rings? Almost dualistic in its cosmology. Almost, it's not. It's almost. In The Hobbit, we don't really feel that, do we? Do we feel that the goblins are part of an evil empire dedicated to the overthrow of the West? I don't really think so. What about the dragon? Is the dragon somehow controlled by the necromancer, who turns out to be Sauron? I don't think in The Hobbit he has anything to do with Sauron, really. He's just a dragon. In its original conception, then, Tolkien's The Hobbit was an autonomous story, written for the amusement of his children and based on the teaching, the text that Tolkien was writing about as a literary critic, and was adapting into his own mythology and to his own stories that he loved to tell to his children. Some of these are now published as well as The Hobbit. So you can read the Father Christmas letters. You can read Roverandom, a comic story of the adventures of a toy dog, of a real dog rather, who becomes a toy dog, who becomes lost, meets dragons and has other adventures before he's restored again at the end, at the happy end of the story. It follows then that the world of The Hobbit was not originally part of Tolkien's plan. But the Silmarillion, the mythology that Tolkien was already well involved with, nevertheless had some influence on The Hobbit. And in the second edition, it became even more consciously part of the background to the story. And of course, background to The Lord of the Rings. So there are two ways then of reading The Hobbit. You can read it as the prequel to The Lord of the Rings, to see how this ring was originally found, which becomes such a powerful symbol in The Lord of the Rings. Or you can read it for its own sake, as a charming story, without the complexities, without the adult style of The Lord of the Rings. It's simply a children's story, but a classic children's story on the level of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, with its map and its treasure hunting, on the level of Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass, perhaps, with its language play, an Oxford Don adapting his philosophy into a story for the amusement of his children. A story that can stand on its own as an adventure, as a complex story which starts off simply as fun, if you like, but ends up then in that great conflict at the end of The Hobbit, where Tolkien almost forgets that he's writing for children, and the story becomes a little bit darker as he explains the war that is set in motion by this treasure and almost causes the world to fall apart in war until, of course, I'm not going to do a spoiler. No, I'm not going to do a spoiler. If you want to read The Hobbit and you've never read it, I thoroughly recommend it to you as a story that can stand on its own. Remember, you're reading a children's story and enjoy it for that, and enjoy the many allusions to medieval poetry, myth, and legend that you can find in it. Thank you very much. Look forward to hearing from you shortly.